Hi there, I'm Dr. Nicolene Shields from Brainwise Academy. Welcome to our masterclass that deals with supporting children throughout change. This masterclass gives some really good tips and strategies, and for you to have a plan in place to help your child cope with changes that are foreseen and also changes that may not be within your control. As parents and carers, we try our very best to support and protect children from changes. And we understand that with neurodiversity, coping with change can be really challenging. So I've put together this masterclass so that you have some tips and strategies to help you as a carer or an educator or a parent to help children cope with changes. So, what we are going to look at today is looking at change in terms of categories. So, you're really going to have a look at change through the lens of a neurodiverse child. To you, changes might be perceived quite differently to how your child or the child in your care perceives changes. And we need to look at it from a point of view of categories. And I'll explain a little bit more what that means throughout the masterclass today. We are going to have a look at how we can categorize changes in order to make negotiated choices around those categories, to give children a greater voice and to help have a more flexible way to establish a new predictability and to empower interdependence so that children develop skills and resilience to progressively cope with changes better over time. So, in order for us to know how to help children cope with change, we need to understand two things that is very much associated with neurodiversity. And these two words are categorization and systemization. I will make use of a whiteboard to help you understand these concepts. But for now, I've included two pictures that might help us start that conversation. So you'll notice on the left that we have some tiny little baskets with two different types of fruit. You'll notice that we have blackberries in one, and we have another type of berry in another one. So when you are thinking of anything, so let's say I say the word elephant, your mind might be retrieving information about what an elephant looks like. Maybe you've seen an elephant before and you didn't like the smell. Perhaps you've seen an elephant be really good at protecting her baby. So there might be concepts and words that come to mind when you think of the word elephant. Categorization is very much the same as that. When you say the word that is connected to a routine, so if I say breakfast, you might be thinking of your favorite breakfast. You might be thinking of toast. You might be thinking of coffee, and you might be thinking about the people that usually attend breakfast with you. For children with neurodiversity, it is slightly different. For you, if I say the word elephant and you have a picture in your mind about an elephant, and I show you a different elephant, maybe it's a pink elephant, and your concept of an elephant, it is that it's a typical gray color. You will be able to replace that one feature, the color of an elephant, but you will still know that that is an elephant. So we have the word and you have ideas connected to that word. So the word elephant is your central schema. So it's your central idea. So schema is another word to say you have a word and you have concepts connected to it. You are able to change the elements that's connected to that word and still know that you have an elephant. That's one of the really big differences between children that are neurodiverse and children that are neurotypical. Neurodiverse children might say that is not an elephant because the concept of pink does not go with elephant. So very important to understand children with neurodiversity will store ideas about things in terms of all of the elements that go with it. So when you say the word elephant, They will know elephant is grey, an elephant is big, an elephant might smell a certain way, an elephant might do certain things. If you change just one of those elephants that's connected to the word elephant, they might be thinking, well, this is not really what I understand an elephant to be, therefore it is not correct. So when you're thinking about routines, and this is really important because when changes happen, routines are usually the first thing to change. So when you're thinking about routine, we have a look at our slide at the bottom. Your child will have elements, I say elephants, will have elements connected to that routine in terms of 4 main categories. And these are the people that are associated with the routine, what you do in the routine, so the activity, what time the routine takes place, and where the routine takes place. So we are going to have a running example of breakfast time as a routine. You might have a different routine at home, and changes that are really big will lead to changes in routines in more than one of these activities. Sometimes families go through really big changes. If you are a carer of a child in a professional setting, child might come to your care environment having experienced big life changes. Big life changes means that you will have changes in at least 2 of these categories across multiple routines. The more categories that are changed, the more difficult the change will be to adapt to for neurodiverse children. So when you are thinking about supporting children with change, the first thing is to be clear in your mind as to how many of the categories associated with that routine will change. So we're going to have an example here. I put some berries in there to be connected to the idea of breakfast. So let's say you have a morning routine and your child is used to mum being the person serving the breakfast and preparing the breakfast. So on a category, we have mother, but with children with neurodiversity, they have very complex sensory needs. So on top of each category, your child might associate that category with certain sensory information. Your child might remember that mum smells a certain way, mum does certain things, mum might be really safe and secure, and mum is predictable, and therefore we can control it. With the activity, when there are routines, children that are neurodiverse are more particular about the order of things. So you might go as far as having breakfast and your child might insist that the toast is sliced diagonally. We have toast, and then we have something on the toast, and then we watch our show. So there will be very strict routines and in many cases associated with an activity. So you'll notice here that I said the word specific, and the activity might be linked to sensory needs as well. If your child has sensory sensitivities, something as simple as having the eggs too close to the toast might be really upsetting. So the routines have very strong activities that have to happen in order. There will be specific time. So your child might really insist on having breakfast at a certain time of the day. And your child might be very particular about where the activity takes place as well. So when you are trying to work out the impact that a change is going to have, make sure that you have a clear picture in your mind as to what is happening in these 4 areas. Now, the next part of looking at the impact of changes and planning support is having a look at something called systemization. So you'll notice here on the right, I've put a picture on here. So systemization is when you have any routine or anything that your child is engaged in, they might be focusing on the details. So if you look at this picture, it looks a bit blurry, what's going on in the background, but systemization is the focus on the details more so than what's happening in the context. So in this picture, the person is having a really strong looking glass focus on a particular component of that picture. So it is the same for children with neurodiversity. They tend to map out routines in terms of minor details that might not be apparent to you. So, for example, when you're thinking about the breakfast routine, one of the details that your child might be really focused on is what the color of the plate is that you serve food on. The child might be really particular about using certain cutlery. Your child might be really particular about needing to sit next to someone on the left rather than the right. So when you are thinking about the impacts of change, it is important to give your child a voice for them to let you know what exactly it is about that routine that is important for them, because their focus on minor details is more important than it is the whole. So when you care for someone with neurodiversity, it might be really difficult to work out why changes are distressing, especially if your child is very young or your child cannot communicate very well. So some of the strategies that we're presenting here is helping you navigate through that, but it's important that you try and get an understanding of what it is about the routine that is very important, and might not be as simple as first we do this, then we do that. It might be tiny details. So this is why it's really important to also look at your child's sensory needs. Does your child find it really difficult to cope with noise? Does your child find it really difficult to cope with too much visual information? So the first step is having a clear understanding of what happens in each of these categories. How many changes are you going to have in each of these categories? And what are the sensory needs of your child that will have an impact on how they focus on the details? Hope that makes a bit more sense. So keep this information in mind as we go through the masterclass, because when you evaluate the impact of change, we need to do it through the lens of neurodiversity. Okay, so we're just going to have a running example. So I've got a little picture in here with a little brain. So in the center, you'll notice that there's a book. This represents a schema. So a schema is an idea or a routine. So whenever your child is exposed to breakfast, they will retrieve kind of like a plan. And this plan has certain things in people, environment, activity, and time. So these 4 categories. So in our example, when this child in this example thinks of breakfast, they think of my mum's going to be there. She's going to make breakfast. My mum and I are going to eat at the kitchen table. We're going to make our toast at the table, and then we're going to watch TV, and we're going to eat at 7 a.m. So we're in time for the cartoons. So when your child thinks of breakfast, and let's say for whatever reason, mum is sick on this particular day, and another relative or dad or another carer has to step in. When you eliminate that one category, you might be thinking, well, we'll just replace that one person with someone else. And that will probably create distress because it means that the whole plan is now broken. And that is the big thing to understand with neurodiversity. When you make changes in one variable, you need to help your child make a new routine instead of just replacing one routine. So it's kind of like running on a treadmill. And the treadmill goes, all the things goes well, and then you have a change happening. So you would need to get off the treadmill to go on a new treadmill. I hope that helps to explain it in a different way. So when children with neurodiversity form routines, they will systemize all the details, and they will use these details to make up a complete picture or a puzzle. So I put a picture here on the right to help you understand that concept. So you will have people, environment, time, and activity. And the concept of breakfast will be all of those 4 parts. So the sum is greater, so the whole is greater than the sum of the parts. So if you take one block out, puzzle's broken, and you will need to help your child reorder all of the pieces, and that is the key. So it's not as simple as taking out this puzzle piece and putting a new puzzle piece in. You will need to make sure that your child is okay. You probably will have to redo the whole puzzle. And that is the difference between coping with changes in amongst neurodiverse children versus neurotypical children who don't have the same capacity for focusing on details and on not set on categorizing. So one of the reasons why children with neurodiversity are so big on categories and focus on details so much is because it helps them put things in order. So systemization is really wanting to do things in a certain way and then getting to the outcome and feeling really good about that outcome. So children with neurodiversity will often do repetitive things. So they might spin things over and over and over. They might talk about the same topics over and over and over. And it's really difficult to understand for other people. And the reason why they do this is because brain is wired in such a way that they get such a big thrill out of things going from one to the next, and they get the outcome. And that is a really big incentive for them to do it again and again and again. And this is part of the reason why children with neurodiversity find it really difficult to change routines, because once they see an outcome that come from those steps and those categories, they want it to repeat. And this is also why it's difficult for children with neurodiversity to learn routines. So you might find yourself having to repeat things over and over and over. And some parents say, we did this yesterday, why can't you remember that we did it today? And it's also because the part of the brain that has to make things automatic doesn't work as well at times. So they like doing things over and over and over again. And once they establish that as a routine, you'll need to help them form a new routine. So they feel like puzzle's not broken, we're just building a new puzzle. So we have an option A, and then we have option B. And option B is that we're making a new puzzle. Okay. So emotional distress can follow change because neurodiversity is associated with difficulty replacing that one piece. And we need to help them make new schemas. So that is the formula. So I've put together 5 steps that you can use to help your child cope with changes. So the first is you need to be aware of what routines are going to be changed in the event that you're expecting a change. So sometimes families go through really big shifts. You might go through a separation, or there might be a death in the family, or there might be changes in carers' work schedules. If you work in an organization, there might be a fundamental shift in the staff that are assigned to help with a child. So if you are foreseeing big changes, I highly recommend that you consider mapping out the possible impact on the child's routines before you introduce the change. This is really important because if you support your children to see a different way of coping with the change, they might be better prepared for it. And this is because children with neurodiversity, when you say something is about to change, they can perceive it as being very dramatic. So for you, it might just be a small change. If you work in a kindergarten room, you might think, well, we're going to have a new educator come in and they're just going to be there for the morning section. That might be a really small change to you because you are able to take one piece out of a schema and put another piece in, and you still have the schema, the puzzle. So you will need to consider what routines are going to change with the implementation of this new plan. And if you cannot foresee changes, and this happens sometimes, it is important to do two things. One is need to allocate more support to help your child. So there needs to be a greater ratio of carers to child. So if you're foreseeing big changes, it's really important to increase the amount of support around your child so that they can opt out if they want to. So if there are new changes coming, is to give the kid a little bit more space to say, I can't do this today. So, okay, let's go and do something else for a while. We can come back to this once we've worked out a plan that you feel comfortable with. So once we have looked at the routine, then we need to look at the purpose of the categories. So what purpose will the categories serve? And you need to, when you think about replacing the puzzle pieces, you need to try and find puzzle pieces that are going to be close to the needs that the other ones met. So for example, if you think about mum served breakfast and mum serves a need, the need is familiarity. The main need might be that there's rapport or connection, and the other need is that it's predictable. If you then find someone that's completely new, that person might not meet the same needs because it's unfamiliar, it's unpredictable, and there's no rapport. So perhaps thinking about, well, how can we change that puzzle piece? We need to find someone else that's going to be familiar, it's going to be predictable, and that the child has some relationship with. So when you're changing the puzzle pieces, try and pick ones that are close to the needs those categories served in the first place. So once you know the needs, then it's a matter of you build a new puzzle. So find a new way to restructure the whole puzzle. And once you have that, make two choices. So for example, if you work out, we're going to have a change with the people that are involved with breakfast, try and come up with two scenarios you can present to your child depending on their developmental need and give them a voice. When there are changes, your child might feel less control. So if there's a greater involvement of your child, depending on the developmental level, but as far as possible, then it will be easier to get back to a place of, well, I was involved in this, so I have some measure of control. And once you have that, then start building new routines. Now, sometimes I get asked by families who are going through really big changes how they need to communicate that. So if your family is going through a fundamental shift in who's going to be around for a long-term period, then it is important to think about communicating that to the child clearly. Sometimes when families go through really big life shifts, they can drip feed information to the child about those changes one piece at a time. So for example, if there is someone in the family that's not going to be around, perhaps you have an adult child that's moving out of home, you have a family member that's deceased, or there's a separation. Sometimes families will give information to neurodiverse children by saying that person's on holiday, or that person is got a new job in another city, rather than saying that person is not coming. So when you are delivering big life changes, it is important to keep your information clear and objective and to the point, so that your child has the opportunity to adjust to that change and you can start forming new routines. So you want to try and minimize the times that routines are going to change. So if it is that that person is not coming back, it might be more beneficial for your child to understand that, to help them to cope and form new routines that are stable and consistent as quickly as possible. So the more times that you change routines in a short period of time, the more distressing it's likely to be for children. The other thing that also just another tip, if you are going to experience a major life change, or there is a major change in the care arrangements around the child for whatever reason, it is also important that if the adults that are responsible for the routines and for care of the child is likely to go through emotional changes, it is a good idea to try and get support in place before you communicate those changes and go through those changes. So if one of the caring adults are going to go through a bereavement, it is a good idea to try and get supportive care in place for your child as much as possible, to try and keep your routines as consistent as possible. When adults go through major life changes, sometimes there can be a really big feeling of guilt when they are not able to continue care for a short period of time. For children that are neurodiverse, they map out the impact of changes around them in terms of how it's going to impact their daily lives, in terms of meeting their needs. So one of the core features of neurodiversity is that these children that are neurodiverse, find it more difficult to see changes from another person's point of view. So you might have more success helping your child with neurodiversity cope with changes by making sure that they have what their needs, their routines are supported as much as possible. So that's what we're going to look at next, is how to make sure that the routines that you put in place are supportive and that are going to be more neurodiverse friendly. Okay, so the first thing we have to do is to review a routine. So I've given you a really simple template here. You might choose to use something like this. I created this online. There are lots of tools online that you can use to create simple templates like these. So I created this template in Canva. You can create it using a Word document, but essentially we want a visual schedule that you can see. So you want to do this mapping out for every routine that's likely to be affected by a change. So we are going to do a running example with breakfast. You might want to pause the video and grab some paper and do this for some of the routines that you think are going to be impacted by change. So in our, it doesn't have to be very complicated. You can just do it like this. So in our example, I just wrote down some information under each activity. So your acronym is PETA. So you can make up words that go with that. So people, we have mother, environment, we have kitchen, we have activity, we're going to eat toast and watch Bluey, and we're going to have it at 7 a.m. So this is the existing routine. So these are the pieces of your puzzle. That's also a schema. So schema is just the psychological term for puzzle. So remember, when you think of breakfast, you think of the people that go with it, where you have breakfast, the time, and what you do at breakfast. So when you have this, so the first step is just write it out for every routine. And the next step is to keep in mind what sensory needs are being met and what rituals go with these categories. So let's have a look at that next. So what I've done here is I've done an add-on. So under people, we have mother. So now we're having a look at the sensory component and the needs. So we know that mother to this child means it's a safe person, it's familiar, and there are definite sensory inputs that are associated with mother that are predictable and that are pleasant. So you might find that some children with neurodiversity might avoid certain people because of the way they sound. They might not like the smells. They might not like the foods they eat. They might not like a couple of different features around it. So when you're thinking about the person's think about what needs does this person serve other than just giving breakfast? And is there any sensory parts to it that your child is familiar with? So in the kitchen, so when you think about environment, the kitchen might be a sensory safe zone. So think about how much sensory stimulation is in the environment. Is the sensory input tolerable? So if the kitchen in this example is a really quiet place, maybe it's not very bright, perhaps it's comfortable. You will need to have a think about those things. So the timing, with timing, it's really important to consider whether that is a starting point to another couple of steps. So the children might very often become defiant or resistant when you change the first thing in a series of things. So in this example, if we consider breakfast is the first thing, because children tend to systemize and they tend to categorize, your routine might form part of a larger routine. So breakfast might be the first thing that is done in the morning routine. So when I say you've got to think about all the routines, you've got to think about, okay, if your change is going to have an impact, not just on breakfast, but it's going to have an impact on dressing, it's going to have an impact on the time you leave for school or kindy or preschool, then that is important to consider as well. So when you have massive changes in the first part of a routine or the end part of a routine, it's likely to have more of an impact, because the first and the last part of any routine, big routine like morning routine, is associated with transitions. So children find it really challenging who are neurodiverse to cope with transitions where there are major shifts, for example, going from home to going out. So when you have massive changes happening in the beginning or the end of a routine, and it's going to have a big impact on transition, your child is probably going to need more support. So some of that more support is you might need more people to help with that transition. You might need to give your child more time, and you might need to negotiate further supports with your child and be patient. So that is something to keep in mind with timing specifically. So with the activity, in our example, food can be a really big trigger point for children that are neurodiverse. So if your change has an impact on foods or the delivery of foods or sleep, it's important to think about more supports around that as well. So in our example, I also put the word visual seeking. Now, sometimes children will seek out sensory input at certain points in the day to help them calm down. So when your change is associated with an activity that your child really likes, and it gives them a strong sensory input, that's important to take note of as well. You might have to replace that with something that's going to give them the same sensory input. Okay, so you'll notice here that I used a template as well. You might, if we go back to the slide over here, you might actually write down what the sensory needs are underneath, or you can do it separately. So I'm just sort of spacing it out so you get an idea. But ideally, you want a visual so that you can see what's involved in every routine and what the purpose of the things in that routine has for your child. Okay, so I've just sort of mapped it out here. So once you've identified some of the needs, you can write it out in a different way. So what I've done here is I've made it more broad and said, well, some of the needs these things or these categories serve for my child is it gives comfort and familiarity. It helps them to predict and control. It meets sensory needs, and it helps my child feel secure. So when you are thinking about rebuilding the puzzle or needing to replace it, sometimes life happens and you need to make changes. So when you need to make changes, try and give your child two choices that will meet the same needs. So for example, the person involved with breakfast gives a great sense of comfort and familiarity. So as I mentioned before, you'll need to find, if mum can't be there for breakfast, it's a good idea to find someone that fits that bill. If watching Bluey in the morning, that is an important transition activity. As I've said before, activities that happen in the beginning of a big routine or at the end of a big routine are really important transition points. And transition point activities give children a greater sense of prediction and control. So children with neurodiversity, because they categorize and they systemize, if one thing goes wrong in one routine, you might have difficulty transitioning to the next routine. So that end routine activity and it going well will give them a greater sense of, oh, okay, well, this went well. Now I can go to the next thing because I know what's going to happen. Then think of the sensory needs and the sense of security as well. So what you will want to do next is you want to create a new template together with those choices. So I'm just going to jump over now to a whiteboard so I can give you some guidance around that. So this is where you will want to brainstorm. So there are lots of vision board templates online. So vision board is where you put different pictures together with things to help you get some ideas. Now, it's a good idea if you can foresee changes happening, whether you're a professional working in a kindy environment or you are a parent and you can foresee changes happening, just getting a big piece of paper out can help you get a visual. If you can see the puzzle, you can then communicate the puzzle in a way that's age appropriate and that will help your child to understand. So children with neurodiversity are very often tend to have stronger visual skills than they do communication skills. It's just the way the brain is wired. So if they can see it and you can move things around until they feel comfortable, you will have a greater chance of them being on board with those new routines. Okay, so if we just think about our categories, so we have people, and then we had environment, we had time, and we had activity. So this is where you can brainstorm 2 alternatives for each point. So let's say for people, remember the needs were we have safety, we have security, and we have sensory needs. So this is where your individual knowledge of your child will be really important. So it's a very, very good idea alongside this to have a bit of a outline of your child's sensory needs. So you might do it this way, you might do it a different way, but it's a good idea to think of sensory needs in terms of visual. You might have seen this before. If your child goes to therapy, this might not be very new to you. So you have auditory needs. You might have tactile needs, and you might have needs for smell and taste. Now, these are, I know that there are more sensory needs, but these are the main ones. Your child might have a really strong body perception need. So your child might find it really difficult to sit still. So that is a sensory need as well, but I'll just keep it to 4 categories to keep it simple. So when you're thinking about sensory needs, it's important to just have clarity in your mind as to what your child's needs are. And then also to think about just 2 categories below that. You want to think about whether your child seeks out sensory information or they tend to avoid sensory information. So there are more complex sensory profiles. If your child goes to an occupational therapist, you might be all over that. But we want to make sure that we have a bit of an idea of what this looks like. So let's say in our case, your child might be seeking out visual information, so really sensitive to, very sensitive to colors, for example. And we know that that is a seeking behavior, okay? So in this instance, if you take Bluey away, that might be a really big trigger point because your child might feel like Bluey gives them a visual input that sets the tone for the rest of the routine. So being mindful of what is really important from a sensory perspective can help you plan better. So let's say an auditory, it might be really sensitive to noise. So noise might be a really big trigger. So when you think about environment, if you are not able to be there for breakfast and your child, for example, needs to go to before school care, you might have to think about how are we going to compensate for this. The same for tactile. It might be the case that your child seeks. You might have this, you might have that going on. So if your child seeks out strong tactile input, they might like a weighted blanket, for example. So, and under taste and smell, a child might have strong food aversions. So some children cannot stand the smell of certain foods. It might be really overpowering for them. So let's say you have these four things on the table. It might be very different for your child. If your child is receiving support from an occupational therapist, it might be a good idea to consult with this therapist to get an idea of what your child's sensory profile looks like. That can be so helpful when you're planning routines. So if you haven't if your child is neurodiverse, getting the input from an occupational therapist might be really helpful for you with this step. So let's say we have this and we have some things that the child will avoid and we have some things that the child will seek out. Another thing to think about is what degree of emotional response you get from your child when they are exposed to different sensory inputs. So you might, as a parent or a carer, know that noise might be a really big trigger. So if this happens, the behavior that goes with it is strong avoidance. So if you have sensitivity to colors and you know that as a strong seeking behavior, you might also get a really big response. So it's important then when you're doing this is to just highlight the areas that are going to probably lead to big emotional responses when it's changed. Because for these ones, you might have to pick replacements that are very close to the needs. Other things you might get away with a little bit better. So if you know that food aversions is not that big of a deal, you can probably think, well, we can probably replace toast with waffles, for example, if we need to, and that's not going to lead to such a big change. So when you have an idea of what the sensory profile looks like, you can then prioritize how to put the new puzzle together. So coming back to our example on the side here, you might consider, okay, well, we know that, let's say with mum is associated with TV, and therefore we know that we can maybe change mum to a different relative, but we can't change the TV. So one of the options that you might think there is there an aunt or another spouse that can take the role? Okay, so let's say in this situation, we decide to replace mum with an aunt. So the aunt is going to change, but we know that Blue is really important and we're not going to change Bluey or whatever show it is. So we're going to change what we can and we're going to try and keep the same as much as we can. So let's say aunt is not available and perhaps the child has a really strong connection to an aunt. Let's say you must get a support worker in or a professional person to take over the role because there's no other alternative. If that is the case, we know that one of the needs was that we really need to make sure that our child has rapport. So you might think of bringing in a support worker, but you go through a period of transition where your child can get used to that person and have time to build rapport. So you might combine mum plus a support worker, and until the child is able to see, well, this person does the same things as mum in the morning. This person is not bad smelling, and this person watches Bluey with me. Yeah, okay, we'll give her a go. So when you are thinking about changes, a really good tip is to couple what's known with what's unknown. So, for example, if you're trying to replace someone that's going to fulfill a care role, you might think, well, maybe mum can be around just long enough for the child to form a relationship with a new carer. so that change is not that big. So you're still working towards meeting your child's needs for security, for sensory needs, and predictability. And so you might do the same thing for the environment. So we know that kitchen was quite a big thing. So perhaps if the aunt has a really nice kitchen, you can trial having the same breakfast in the new kitchen at the aunt's house. So we can do aunt's kitchen, but then you keep the menu the same. So we're just going to do the same thing at the aunt's house. We're going to watch Bluey and we're going to have toast. Just going to do it at the aunt's kitchen. Or you might say that we're going to do the child's kitchen, but perhaps the aunt wants to make more waffles. So you can see what we've done here is when you're thinking of choices, you want to try and keep in mind what is important for your child. So if you're thinking about changing to waffles, one way to do that, remember our idea is we've got to couple the old and the new until your child's okay with the new. So do that as far as possible. So when you're thinking about waffles, you might serve toast and waffles together until your child's okay with just having waffles. So always try and think about having the old with the new until your child's okay with just the new. So wherever possible, when you're planning really big changes, try and think about preparation and giving your child some time to be okay with those new changes. So in terms of timing, so in our example, remember we said that activity is really important starting point for a larger routine. So you might think, well, this routine is really important because if we get past this, then we can go and get dressed, we can put our shoes on, and then we can start our day. So if this routine is really important, you might say, well, we're going to keep breakfast at 7 a.m., but we're going to have new carers, or you might say we're going to have different food. Sometimes it is really important. Sometimes I've made a bit of it's a bit overlapping there. Sorry, just I've overlapped it there. Apologies for that. So let's say your time is you want to keep it to 7 a.m., but sometimes you have to change the time. There's just no other choice. Think about, okay, we can't, we have to change the timing of breakfast, but perhaps we can change the timing of, we have to change the timing of breakfast. You know, all of those things are important. So perhaps we can watch Bluey until the care arrives, then we have breakfast. So you keep the elements the same, you're just trying to change the timing around. So we can Bluey first, then breakfast if we have to wait a bit for the new carer to come, for example. And this is how you build that new puzzle. You try and create a new scenario with two options. Now, your child might not be in a position to communicate with you about whether they like this new change or not. If this is the case, it's a really good idea to have a visual board with pictures. So as far as possible, let your child see the new routine and go with them through it. And wherever you can, try and only change one thing at a time. So sometimes when people go through major life changes, it is challenging to have that balance between this is what is important for the family and this is what is or the larger organization, and this is what's going to be relevant for the child. And finding that balance is difficult at times. I grant you that. If you can foresee big changes, try and just change one thing at a time. So with neurodiversity, the slower you go, the more support you offer, the better your chances of those new routines sticking and it being successful. So if you are planning major life changes, try and give your child a little bit of time. The golden number, they say, is 21 days in psychology. That's what the research says, apparently. So if someone goes through a new habit for 21 days without breaking that habit, they're more likely to sustain that habit over time. It's the same for kids. If you can sustain a new routine for 21 days, you have a better chance of it sticking. So when you think about the number of routines that you have to plan out, if you put it all on paper, you might have to give your child close to a month to get used to new changes. So I hope that helps. All right, so we are just going to go back to our presentation. Okay, so once you've got a template for your new choices, wherever possible, give your child the opportunity, to have a voice. Sorry, I keep going back. Okay, so you want to make sure that you give your child a voice. Wherever possible, negotiate voices. So if your child is of an age we understand and they can participate, ask is, would you rather? So the idea is present this new template and then say to you, would you rather do something else? Now, for children with neuroplasticity, being presented with more than a couple of choices might be overwhelming in itself. This is why you try and prepare 2 choices before you negotiate with them. They might say, no, I don't like either of those, and then you can give them a different choice. But it's important to put boundaries around it as well. To sell, we've got option 1, 2, or 3. Which one would you? I don't want to do anything like that. That's when it might be where you either need to think about whether this is just extremely anxiety provoking for your child or whether this is planned behavioral defiance. Now, for those of you who want to lead and defiance, we do have some great mini courses available on the website. I think I'll do another masterclass on as well. But for today, try and give. And so you might do 2 picture options. So maybe if your child is on, you have to negotiate someone else coming in, you might do a picture of your aunt or a picture of a new support work, help your child to get used to. So some of the questions you might ask, is carer that feels safe? Would you rather choose a different food option? Would you rather watch Bluey another time? Or would you rather take a break after breakfast? So using your child's expression of anxiety is a really good gauge for you as to whether you're on the right track or not. Now, sometimes, despite your best efforts, kids might not want any of these changes. And if that does happen, that's where you might have to think of a different approach that say, okay, let's opt out. We'll come back to this another time. So sometimes it is a good idea to let it go. And if your child is getting really distressed, try and divert them to doing something fun that they really do like before revisiting the topic. Okay, so on that note, if your child is showing you some defiance, what I would recommend is stop the activity and check in. So when your child becomes really anxious, he or she might not be able to communicate any choices whatsoever to you. If that is the case, it might be a good idea to say, okay, let's go and do something fun. Or say, I wonder what would happen if we did something fun together instead. So tread carefully and with patience around changes. And remember that the changes that you are planning to make might globally look like it's not that big a deal. But if you think about that picture with the looking glass and the details, you might see a big blur, but your child might see all the little details in between. So we want to get clarity as to what that looks like, offer choices wherever we can, and support a transition to achieving those. So another last tip is always try and get a contingency plan in place. So for example, if you are planning a change and let's say the aunt comes over and you mapped it all out and it's not going well, child's getting very anxious, have a contingency plan in place. So the contingency plan needs to be the that you assign someone that can step in to help. So, for example, you might give the aunt a phone number and say, please call me on this number if it's not going well, and communicate it to your child. So your child knows that they can give this a go, and if it doesn't work out, there will be a plan in place that they feel comfortable with. So you can say to your child, Auntie so-and-so is going to be here to help you make toast this morning, and you practice it. You give your child a visual schedule, as we've shown, and then to say, I love you. If you need mummy, Auntie so-and-so can give me a call. And do that at least for a transition period until your child feels 100% safe and comfortable. And you've gone through 21 days of going through this routine with minimal upsets, and also to have an opt-out. So I hope that will be helpful to you. Let us know your comments. My email address is right there. You're also welcome to post some feedback on the portal. Thank you for listening. I'm Dr. Nicolene Shields.